It was 9:52 on a Tuesday night when Dorian Cole turned his master key into the wrong door. He had been on his feet for 16 hours, repairing a flooded boiler room 2 floors below, and every hallway in Lakeshore Crest Towers had started to look the same. His apartment was 9C. The door that swung open under his hand was 9D, and it was already unlocked. He stepped inside and stopped cold. Elena Vance was kneeling on the living room floor in the dark. A torn manila folder spilled open in front of her, a cracked silver picture frame beside her bare feet. No blazer, no heels. Mascara streaked down to her jaw. She looked up at him, and for 3 seconds, neither of them breathed. "Please," she whispered, "forget what you just saw." Dorian didn't answer. His eyes weren't bitter on her face. They were on the single typed line, peeking out from under the folder. Patent rights transferred. Compliance window, 30 days. He knew exactly what that sentence meant. He'd read 100 just like it, during 6 years auditing fraud cases for a Chicago bank, before his wife died, and he walked away from spreadsheets forever. He stepped back, closed the door, and went home, to 9C, without a word. Everyone in this building thought he just fixed leaky faucets. The woman crying on that floor had no idea the only man in the building who could read that sentence for what it really was had just shut her door on it. If someone begged you to forget what you saw, but staying silent could cost them everything, would you walk away? Dorian woke at 5:30 the next morning, without an alarm, the way he always did. He swung his legs off a narrow bed in a 1-bedroom staff unit that smelled faintly of pine, cleaner, and padded barefoot to the kitchen, where the walls were covered floor to ceiling in crayon drawings. Dinosaurs, rockets, a lopsided sun, all signed in shaky 6-year-old handwriting. Milo. Milo appeared in the doorway dragging a stuffed dinosaur by its tail, climbed onto a stool, and opened his sketchbook while Dorian poured cereal. "Daddy, why do some doors look the same?" Milo asked without looking up. Dorian paused, spoon halfway to the bowl. "Sometimes they do, buddy. You just have to look closer at the number." Milo nodded, like that answered everything, and kept drawing. 2 stick figures on a rooftop, under a sky full of stars. One star colored bigger than the rest, in thick yellow crayon. Every Friday night, the 2 of them climbed to the building's roof, with a blanket, to look at exactly that kind of sky. No exceptions. Not once in 2 years. Dorian packed Milo's lunch, walked him to the bus, and disappeared back into the building's walls for the next 9 hours, replacing a hallway light, snaking a drain, resetting a breaker panel. Residents called him hey, or pointed at faucets without looking at his face. Nobody said thank you. Nobody knew that 6 years earlier, he had sat behind a glass-walled office at Halbrook Trust. The analyst colleagues called the ledger, because he didn't need software to see the shape of stolen money. He could read a spreadsheet for 30 seconds and find the seam where the fraud was sewn shut. He'd helped unravel 2 major embezzlement cases worth over $90 million combined. The day his wife died in a car accident 18 months later, he placed his resignation letter on his director's desk and never opened a financial model again. Until last night, across town, Elena Vance walked into the boardroom of Vance Pharmaceuticals as if the night before hadn't what happened. Her father had built the company from a 2-room lab into a $300 million biotech firm before a stroke took him 18 months ago, and the company, along with every enemy he'd never known he had, passed straight to her. At the head of the table stood Richard Voss, Chief Operating Officer, 51, silver-templed, a man her father had trusted like a brother for 2 decades. He presented the quarterly trial results with practiced ease, strong enrollment numbers, promising data, a smiling slide for every question. The board nodded along. One member said, "Outstanding work, Richard." Elena said nothing. Her pen pressed so hard into her notepad, the tip bent. For weeks, she'd had been tracking a discrepancy in trial funding. $11 million routed through consulting invoices she couldn't trace to any real vendor. The folder on her apartment floor last night held shipment records for a critical clinical trial. Half the listed shipments had never happened. Someone was quietly sabotaging her father's flagship drug trial from the inside, and the typed letter clipped to the folder from a law firm she'd gave her 30 days before the company's largest licensing partner would be legally entitled to walk away with the patent for pennies. She didn't fully understand the structure of it. She wasn't a forensic analyst, but her instinct screamed that someone inside this building was bleeding the company dry from within. After the meeting, Richard lingered at the door, voice warm, almost paternal. "You look exhausted, Elena. Let finance handle the heavy lifting." It sounded like concern. It was a cage. That evening, the elevator doors opened on the 9th floor, and Dorian was kneeling by a light fixture outside Unit 9E. Their eyes met for half a second. Elena looked away first, stepped past him, and shut her door without a word. She didn't know he stood in that hallway, a full 3 seconds longer than the job required, staring at the light still glowing under her threshold. 2 days later, a maintenance request came through for 9D, a malfunctioning thermostat. Dorian knocked, and Elena opened the door in a gray sweater. No makeup, voice flat. "Fix it and go." He knelt by the wall panel. The dining table behind him was stacked with documents, half covered by a kitchen towel. One corner of a spreadsheet peeked out. He reset the thermostat, stood, and on his way to the door, his eyes, trained for 6 years to read numbers the way a hawk reads open ground, caught 2 seconds of the exposed page. Shipment dates, routing codes, numbers structured just under the threshold that would trigger an internal audit. Elena yanked the towel over the table. He said nothing, until his hand was already on the doorknob. "Those shipment codes aren't routed through one distributor," he said, back to her, voice low. "There's a second layer hiding behind the first. If you're only checking the obvious one, you'll never find where the money actually exits." The room went silent. "What did you just say?" "Thermostat's fixed." He stepped into the hallway and pulled the door shut. Elena stood frozen for a long moment. Then she crossed to the table, pulled the towel away, and opened her laptop. She followed the thread he'd described, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she found the second layer, a shipping subcontractor that didn't actually exist anywhere except on paper. The man who fixed her thermostat had just done in 10 seconds what her entire finance team had failed to do in 3 weeks. She called Priya Shah, her head of research, and the only person at the company she still trusted without reservation. "I need everything you can find on the building superintendent," Elena said. What Priya found that night was almost nothing. Education, employment, residential history, ordinary, until 2016, where the trail simply stopped. A single fragment in a financial sector personnel database that should have been redacted, but wasn't. Senior fraud analyst, voluntarily separated. Dorian Cole wasn't a man who'd quit fixing things for a living. He was a man the banking industry had once considered one of its sharpest minds, and nobody at Lakeshore Crest had the faintest idea. Can you imagine carrying that kind of silence for 6 years, just to keep a promise to a 6-year-old? 1 week later, the story detonated. Leaked documents hit financial media, carefully selective, devastatingly one-sided. CEO Vance accused of reckless oversight as flagship trial collapses. Richard Voss wasn't mentioned once. 3 board members called for Elena's resignation before the markets closed. Richard sat at the far end of the emergency meeting table, hands folded, voice gentle. "I don't want to see you go, Elena, but the numbers don't lie." He had engineered the leak himself, selecting exactly which documents to release and which context to strip, clearing the path for a private equity buyer named Hale Whitcomb to acquire Vance Pharmaceuticals at a fraction of its value and sell off her father's patents piece by piece. Elena had suspicions. She had spreadsheets she barely understood, and a letter from a law firm she couldn't trace. The board scheduled a vote in 9 days. If she couldn't prove her case by then, she would lose everything her father had built. That night, riding the elevator home, the doors opened on the 9th floor, and Dorian was kneeling beside a vent housing, screwdriver in hand. He looked up. She looked down. Neither spoke, but he saw, in the particular hollowness behind her eyes, the look of someone losing a war she didn't yet know how to fight. 20 minutes later she found him in the basement, replacing a filter, sleeves rolled to his elbows. "Who are you?" she asked. He didn't look up. "The guy who fixes your pipes. A team of forensic accountants couldn't trace what you found in 10 seconds. He set the wrench down. "You've got 9 days before the vote. That should be enough." He picked it back up. She stood there a long time, watching a man in a gray maintenance uniform calmly dismantle a clogged filter with the same hands that had just begun dismantling an $11 million fraud. Something shifted in the way she saw him, permanently. That night, alone in his apartment after Milo was asleep. Dorian pulled a laptop from beneath the bed, one he hadn't opened in 6 years. The forensic tracing software he'd built himself during his last big case loaded slowly across the dark screen. He hadn't touched it since the funeral. Tonight, he opened it anyway. He had 2 sources, the routing pattern memorized from 2 seconds at Elena's table, and public filings, state shell company registries, customs records, licensing databases. The software cross-referenced layer after layer while he guided it, patient and precise. By 4 in the morning, the picture was complete. $9.2 million. Routed through 3 shell distributors, across 2 states. Deposited into a single account, registered under the name Voss Logistics Holdings. Every transfer carried the same digital fingerprint. Richard Voss wasn't protecting the trial. He was hollowing it out from the inside, manufacturing a crisis so the company would collapse into Whitcomb's hands at a discount and disappear with a payout once the deal closed. Dorian printed 11 pages, transfer maps, shell registrations, timestamps, slid them into an envelope, and left them outside Elena's door at 6 the next morning. He knocked twice and walked away. She read it standing in the doorway. By page 4 she was sitting on the floor, hands shaking, staring at a transfer map more detailed than anything her hired accountants had produced in 3 weeks. What she didn't know was that Dorian had already found something else, a name buried in an old whistleblower complaint Richard had quietly buried 2 years earlier. A former clinical operations manager named Theo Brandt, fired under circumstances nobody had questioned at the time, now living off the grid 2 hours outside the city. Dorian found him in under 2 days. Theo opened the door of a rented house with the face of a man who'd been waiting for a knock he hoped would never come. He threatened my family, Theo said, hands trembling. Said he'd bury me if I talked. He's going to bury 300 people's jobs if nobody does, Dorian said quietly. The silence stretched almost a full minute. Then Theo went inside and came back with a flash drive he'd unearthed. Kept hidden for 2 years, internal emails between Richard Voss and Hale Whitcomb, laying out the entire acquisition plan month by month. 3 days before the board vote, Richard struck first. He filed a formal complaint accusing Dorian of unauthorized entry and surveillance of a resident, demanding his immediate termination and eviction from staff housing within 48 hours. Management didn't argue. The call lasted 4 minutes. That afternoon, Dorian stood in the doorway of 9C and began taking Milo's drawings off the wall, careful not to tear the tape. When Milo came home from school and saw the bare walls and stacked boxes, he stood very still, hugging his dinosaur. "Are we moving again, Daddy?" His voice was small and steady, the voice of a child who'd learned not to cry about things that kept happening. "We'll be okay, buddy," Dorian said, kneeling in front of him. "We always are." Elena found him in the hallway that evening, carrying a box toward the service elevator. "Richard did this because you're the only proof he's afraid of." Dorian set the box down. "I know, but I've got a kid, Elena. I don't get to play hero." She looked at him, not the analyst, not the handyman, but the father, choosing his son over everything else. "Then let me fight," she said. "Give me everything you have." He handed her the flash drive and the full report without another word. The night before the vote, Richard hosted a celebration dinner for the board at a private restaurant downtown. One final performance before the company changed hands. Elena arrived uninvited, alone, carrying nothing but a flash drive between her fingers. The table went silent as she sat down and placed it in front of Richard. "Before anyone votes tomorrow," she said, "I'd like to show you the real version of this trial collapse." Richard smiled, practiced and dismissive. "Elena, this isn't the $9.2 million, she said. 3 shell companies, your name on every single transfer. Nobody in that room could have predicted what came next." The restaurant door opened, and Theo Brandt walked in, pale and thin, followed by Priya Shah carrying a stack of notarized statements. Richard's smile didn't fade. It died, the way a light dies when the wire is cut. Theo read his statement aloud, the threats, the forged sign-offs. 2 years hiding from a man he'd once trusted. Elena projected the emails from the flash drive onto a laptop screen. Richard and Hale, Whitcomb, outlining a takeover plan month by month, asset by asset. "That maintenance man fabricated all of this," Richard said, standing, voice fraying at the edges. He broke into systems he had no business. His name is Dorian Cole, Elena said, calm, cutting through him. 6 years ago, he helped recover $90 million in fraud cases for one of this city's largest banks. He found your entire trail in one night, what you spent 3 years trying to bury. She let the silence sit. You told everyone he fixes faucets. He's the reason your empire has a leak you couldn't plug. The board voted 7-0 the next morning. Elena stayed CEO. Richard was escorted out by 2 compliance attorneys before the FBI even finished reviewing the file. 300 employees went to work the next day with no idea how close they'd come to losing everything. 2 weeks later, Elena personally voided Dorian's eviction notice. The property manager simply knocked on 9C and said, "Disregard the letter. Mr. Cole, you're staying." She offered him a position too, Director of Financial Integrity, a private office, a salary 20 times what he made fixing pipes. He said no. "I fix things, Elena. That's what I do." She studied him. You could fix things on a much bigger scale. He looked past her, through the hallway window, to where Milo sat on a bench outside, sketchbook open in the afternoon light. "I already am." On Friday night, Dorian and Milo climbed to the rooftop with their blanket, the way they always did. The rooftop door opened behind them, and Elena stepped through carrying 2 cups of hot cocoa and a small paper bag of cookies. She didn't say anything, just sat down beside them, close enough that her sleeve nearly touched his arm. Milo grabbed her hand and pulled her closer. "Look, that one's the brightest. Daddy always finds it first." The 3 of them lay there under the Chicago sky, saying nothing, because for once, nothing needed to be said. Some doors, once opened by mistake, refused to close, and the person standing on the other side turns out to be exactly the one nobody knew they needed.